Hi, I'm Robert Guzman, and we're going to talk about the Philip Caputo book, A Rumor of War. In this, we get a first-hand experience of a Marine who's a junior officer in the platoon, the 3-9. And in this book, we're going to get a great idea of how the Vietnam War was actually a terrible war for these soldiers. I'm going to start with the notable experience I believe was the most important in this book, which is on page 93, which actually talks about Philip Caputo's first time seeing a Viet Cong guerrilla, and in that he actually gets shot at, and for the first time he feels horrified and he is terrified from the fear that he has of actually being shot, because you see this human element of Americans feeling like, why am I getting shot at? I did nothing wrong to that person. But you really see that this is a very serious situation while being in Vietnam. At the very beginning of the book, Philip Caputo starts with the end of Vietnam, so him being back, and he actually mentions how he feels older than his father from the situations he was in and what he witnessed during the Vietnam War. Also in that, he says that he doesn't want any more surprises, and he really actually feels disconnected from social life when he comes back. Also, I believe that experience of him being shot at and feeling fear illustrates to these innocent men who had come that they were actually getting into a very deep conflict during the Vietnam War. It mentions that they wanted to get things for their khaki uniforms for the Marines, and Vietnam was that war that they could do this at. But once they get there, they actually find out that this war is not about hand-to-hand combat with these guerrillas, but it's more about seeking out the enemies in these jungles. Many times, Philip Caputo is actually talking about how they're just really waiting around. Also, when they are at base camps, they are in a lot of very bad behavior, drug use, sex, and other things that are just not very professional for Marines. Yet when they're in boot camp, you really see this discipline that's instilled in Caputo. You see that he really wants for success. Also, that the weaker men aren't going to make it through the boot camp when he's there, and that they are going to totally take out the element of self-worth during boot camp, so that these men could actually go through the toils and tribulations and ordeal that is ahead of them, which is the Vietnam War. Also in that, with the physical and psychological abuse during boot camp, you see that there's a lot of actual mistakes made while they're in the boot camp phase. Once they get to Vietnam, the confusion and the things they go through is just way more escalated. Once they get into the jungles of Vietnam, they actually have way more issues with the insects, with the climate, and sunstroke. Caputo is able to capture this experience of having the constant fear of seeing Viet Cong, because they don't know whenever they're going to come out. Many times he's also mentioning that the people within his platoon are worried about seeing a Viet Cong while on night watch. And one time in particular, he talks about having to throw a grenade so that one of his men in his platoon will stop. I'd already been shooting, and he was actually not shooting at a Viet Cong. He was actually shooting at a bush. He just had a fear. Through this, we see a breaking of innocence with American young men. Early on, Caputo captures this idea of feeling security and comfort and peace while living in Illinois when he's a teenager, and he has a hunger for danger and challenges and violence. By joining the Marines, he's able to feel that rebellious phase and being able to feel independence. That also had a lot of consequences by having to go through all the things he went through by joining. Something that these men are also going to endure is the la cafard, which is a French word for depression, because these soldiers were actually going through something much like PTSD, but even easy things were very hard for them because of the fear that they were feeling of the idea of feeling like they were going to just die. There were a lot of rules pertaining to people like Philip Caputo and all the soldiers in Vietnam, because you couldn't fire upon anybody. Also, there were a lot of Vietnamese who were continuing their lifestyle, who were still like walking the streets, tending to their fields, and these soldiers were just like left bored and marching in a line, and Caputo captures that, especially the element of having to wait. This really changes when helicopters and more equipment come in. You see that this becomes very violent when they're searching through the jungles for the Viet Cong. Also, he mentions that a lot of this war is during the night. During this war, he also becomes part of an office where he has to record casualties during the war, and in this, he just gives grueling details of how he has to see lots of dead young men, and he just is very vivid with the imagery that he gives in this book. Also, he mentions another notable experience about Frank Reasoner on page 193, and I think this captures really like this brotherhood element in this book, where he's just having a beer with Reasoner, and that same day he goes out on near Charlie's Ridge, and he actually ends up coming back on a helicopter and dead. And from this, we see another situation with Gonzalez from his platoon in 1965. You see that these soldiers are very connected with themselves. They are their own family. And in this, we see that these soldiers, because of this brotherhood, want to inflict pain upon the Vietnamese. It gives them an extra vengeance upon them. They feel hate. They feel disconnected from emotion. They feel really nothing from what they do to these Vietnamese people. And I believe that Caputo is showing the real nature of this war, that this war wasn't about just getting prowess and getting these badges for their uniforms. This was a war that got them actually very involved in conflict that was different than what they had been taught during Marine boot camp. They were expecting to be always fighting, yet they found out that they were actually going to be waiting for the enemy to come after them during the night. They were very scared in this whole thing, and it shows this fear that just tears them apart and takes them away from these ideas of enjoying, say, a dance. His ideas of San Francisco and thinking back of a woman. He thinks that felt so long ago, even though it only had been a few years. Caputo is showing that these soldiers had to live with the constant fear that they were going to die. And if someone in their platoon died, it was just a normal day while being in Vietnam. Philip Caputo gives a lot of great experiences about his time in Vietnam. And I think that he is able to capture that this toll on soldiers is very actually sad, with the evil and the immoral things that they had to see. Seeing the deaths of their friends and killing of Vietnamese people just was terrible. I think that this was a war that these young men, who may not have been very educated, saw a time that they could get away and become independent, yet with that, they may not have actually really enjoyed just joining just to have that, because they had to see death and this constant fear that just tears you up. And then when you come back to the United States, you just don't want to engage in social things. You can't really live with yourself because of all the things that you had to live with. So I believe that Caputo writes a great book showing the real essence of this war, and I thought it was a great read. Thank you.